speaker, who has drawn quite a large audience for this Friday before Labor Day, is Chet Orloff, Executive Director of the Oregon Historical Society and City Club member. The title of his address is Seeking Eden and the Peopling of Oregon, Immigration and History. An immigrant to Oregon himself, Chet Orloff moved to Portland from Washington in 1962. He later graduated from Lincoln High School, Boston University, and the University of Oregon. In addition to his diplomas in the archaeology and history of the Pacific Northwest, Chet holds a graduate degree from the Portland State University and the Historical Society in museums and historical agency management. Showing a strong dose of volunteerism, Chet was a member of the Peace Corps in Afghanistan from 1972 to 1975, and then began his work at the Historical Society as a volunteer. Progressing to assistant director of the society, he then left in 1986 to help establish a new historical society to develop the history of law in the American West, known as the Ninth Circuit Historical Society. He also founds and edited its journal, Western Legal History. During the past 15 years, he's also made time to serve on several community boards and committees, as well as on the Metropolitan Arts Commission and the Portland Planning Commission. Appointed executive director of the Oregon Historical Society in December 1991, he and his staff are now developing plans for strengthening the society's statewide educational programs, building on a century of collecting Oregon history. Many changes are in store for the society and its history center on the South Park blocks. Chet Orloff believes that, contrary to the common view, the aim of history is really to look forward, to help plan ahead by looking at how we got to where we are. History is not simply the record of what has occurred, it's our architecture, the landscape of our city, our neighborhoods, and the associations we all have among family, friends, fellow workers, and the wider society at large. History helps citizens connect with their community and inspires their active participation in it. Good citizenship, the appreciation and application of knowledge of one's community, is, to our speaker, the ultimate purpose of history, and I would remind you, the purpose of City Club. So it's most appropriate that we host Chet today. In his address, Chet will describe what he considers a paramount connection shared by all Oregonians, that we come from immigrant stock who came for similar reasons, that although we recognize the Oregon Trail as one of our state's icons, there are actually many historic trails to Oregon. Chet Orloff.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here amongst my fellow City Club members. I'm especially honored to follow hard on the heels of Governor Barbara Roberts, who spoke here last week. And I will resist the temptation, which is great, of course, to talk about tax reform. Today I'm going to talk about the connection that we all share, the common denominator among all of us who number ourselves Oregonians. We all are immigrants to Oregon, for we, or our parents, or our great-grandparents of a century, or 100 centuries ago, all came here as immigrants. And the reasons we came are few, but similar. The notion that out west was something worth getting to is an old one. The Romans had visions of the West full of myths, and they sent their merchants and legions marching and sailing their way to the western isles of Britain. Mystery, too, has always been there in the minds of those whose eyes looked westward. A certain fascination with the beyond, thrill and challenge of the unknown, and of course, the hope for great wealth has always been a constant. This year we celebrate the quincentenary of Columbus's landfall in the West Indies. Less than 100 years after his voyage, Spain sent her conquistadors west. Gold and new land were the prizes. By the 18th century, the outlines of our own Pacific coast had been well sketched on the colorful and sometimes imaginative maps that inspired European sovereigns and lured their sea captains halfway around the earth. To those whose minds traveled to this corner of the globe, the western edge of the continent was an Eden, a garden filled with noble savages, wise to a wilderness, rich with marvelous plants and animals. Some held out hope that here would be found the wisdom and wealth that would propel the old world to new prosperity. From the first European contact, hope and aspiration played their part in what would ultimately be called the Oregon country. But what was west to Europeans was east to Oregon's first immigrants. The trails to Oregon lead from many directions. The first Oregonians actually arrived from the north, having pushed down from the Bering Land Strait Bridge across the Canadian landmass and into the high plateau country east of the Cascades. Imagine, if you will, a family extended in relatives and expanding across time that 13,000 years ago spot, perhaps even having lunch, and trapping fish in the streams that drain the hills above us. They are spearing and bowing elk and deer in what is now Forest Park, and they are digging roots along the banks of the river that flows just a few hundred yards away. For more than 80 centuries, these people lived here, leaving but fragile reminders of their presence, heaps of shells and bones, some cleared forest land in the Willamette Valley, the skillfully shaped remains of their wood and stone culture, and the creatively evocative stories of animals with canny humors and mountains venting volcanic anger. That was the first trail. The map of Oregon next reveals what we will call the Trail to Discovery. Those who traveled its several forks were propelled by visions of a new world. Depending on the perspective, it was a world ready to be claimed, tamed, studied, or plundered. It was a land that attracted explorers and scientists, the Spaniard Malaspina, the Englishman Cook in Vancouver, the Dane and Russian employee Vitus Bering, the Frenchman Laperouse, and the American Gray, Lewis and Clark, and Wilkes. It attracted fur traders and trappers, including again Robert Gray, Donald Mackenzie, and that majority of scoundrels, the mountain men. And it drew missionaries, the Lees of Salem and the ill-fated Whitmans of Wailatpu. All were intrepid men and women, curious to a degree, devout and driven, oft-times greedy, sometimes well-meaning, always aggressive, ranging from 18th century Enlightenment thinkers to 19th century crusading moralists. A wide trail, this one. When Lewis and Clark were preparing to leave the Oregon country in 1806, at the end of a wet winter spent at Fort Clatsop, Captain Clark paddled off the Columbia and entered a large river. Soon after entering the Multnomah River, Lewis wrote in his journal, Captain Clark was met by an Indian alone in a canoe. After some conversation with him, the pilot, another local Indian, informed Captain Clark this old man belonged to the Clackamas Nation, who reside 40 miles up the Multnomah. Further up, Captain Clark reached a large wooden house. The guide informed him that this house is the temporary residence of members of the Cushook Nation, who reside just below the falls of the Multnomah. The inhabitants had left their canoes and air bladders, mats, oil jugs, baskets, bowls, and trenchers lying about the house at the mercy of every visitor, proof indeed of the mutual respect for the property of each other. The guide informed Captain Clark further that a small distance were 2 bayous on which were a number of small houses belonging to the Cushooks. This is the first written description of the future site of our city. The third trail is the one that we are perhaps most familiar with, the subject of countless books and movies, and one that we'll fairly trip over next year as we commemorate its 150th anniversary, the Oregon Trail, the Trail to Eden. Early in 1819, Englishman William Foe crossed the Atlantic to gather materials for a book that, in his words, would, quote, show men and things as they are. In the East, he found both in bad order. the trail to Oregon began in a pothole. The cities were littered with garbage, the roads disgraceful, the inns verminous, and the farms poorly kept. The Americans, it seemed to Foe, were too prone to plunging off into the wilderness in search of new land. The American, he wrote, has always something better in his eye, further west. Hope and aspiration. This vision of a fair land, this notion of Eden, this lure of a better life was older than the nation itself, and at times inspired lofty thoughts. Yet the Western Americans, in Malcolm Clark's words, were a bark-skinned lot. There were few saints among them, and all were riveted fast to the main chance. No niceties impeded these pioneers. Where spoons were luxuries, fingers would do. It was sweat, not perspiration, and soap did not place high on the list of baggage heading across the plains. And of course, if the prospects in Oregon seemed too hard, there was always California. In A.B. Guthrie's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, The Way West, several men argue whether to take their wagon train along the fork to Oregon or to California. I still say Oregon, Evans told him, and looked around to see what answer words brought to the faces. Sure, I don't blame you a mite. You're big and stout. I bet you get there, and you'll probably like it. I know folks as does. Of course, for the weak and ailin', I got to say, maybe California's better. For the way is short and easy, and it appears like no one ever dies there. But it was not all hardship and hardness. Terence O'Donnell, who spoke with us last year, reminds us that most immigrants came to Oregon not for gold, not for military conquest, not for speculation, but rather to live quiet, decent lives in a place beautiful and bountiful. To be sure, rigid politics and old prejudices followed along the trail and into the rich river valleys of the Oregon country, but still, hopes and aspirations for a decent life led the pioneers on, led them along the trail to Eden. The next trail, the Trail of Steel, was built on the skeleton of the Indian and the back of the Chinese laborer. From the 1860s through the 1920s, roads and railroads spread out across Oregon like a great pulsing network of arteries, veins, and capillaries. In the 1870s, 4 young men, opposed to the Manchus and leading intolerably poor lives, shipped to America where cheap labor was wanted for road building. A decade later, their younger brother and his son, Inge, followed. Moving to Walla Walla, the family joined thousands of other Chinese who were working in the wheat fields and the canneries and on the roads and railroad beds of Oregon and Washington. In 1887, Inge's father returned to China, leaving a letter preserved in the Historical Society's library that said, "Let the old go back home and rest. Let the young seek their fortune abroad." Inge, a 21-year-old greenhorn with only pidgin English, moved to John Day, where he eventually opened an herbal pharmacy. During the influenza epidemic of 1919, members of a road-building crew, now all Caucasian, fell ill during the cold, wet winter on the windy hills between John Day and Portland. When word reached Inge of their danger, he drove out on icy roads with gallons of his bitter and terrible-smelling herbal potions. Doubting the abilities of local physicians to treat them, the men trusted the medicine of the China doctor, Inge. They survived, I should add, both Dr. Hay's potions and the deadly flu. His pharmacy, Kam Wah Chung, is still preserved in John Day. Inge had traveled the Trail of Steel as well as the Trail to Work. On the Trail to Work, we find a century's worth of tracks leading from 100 or more parts of the globe. We have Basque sheep herders trailing to southeastern Oregon, Hispanics and Dust Bowl migrants from Oklahoma finding their way west to the orchards and fields of the Willamette Valley. Scandinavians, mainly Finns, came to Astoria to pull the fishing nets to fill the canneries. An old joke goes, "How are a salmon and the Columbia at its mouth similar?" They have fins on both sides. Families from Ireland filled the northeastern corner with such names as O'Neill, O'Shea, and O'Reilly, Kildare, Kilbride, and Kilkenny. John Kilkenny arrived near Heppner in 1890 and worked on a road crew until 3 years later He had saved and borrowed enough money to buy land and sheep to start his own ranch. Today, his son John is Oregon's senior federal court judge. The Trail of Promise, long in coming, came to full flood in 1905 when the gates of the Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition in Northwest Portland swung open to greet visitors from around the world. Hundreds of thousands of tourists came to see the magnificent pavilions, the world's largest log cabin, the lighted esplanades, the exotic displays and restaurants, and the people from dozens of equally exotic lands, all strolling along the shore of what was once Giles Lake. The exposition was conceived and organized by the Oregon Historical Society. Now there's a little known historical fact for you. It was the West's first World's Fair, and it focused national and international attention on the promise of Oregon and the beauty and bounty of our state. At a time when growth was looked at with trust and not with trepidation, the fair helped Portland grow by nearly 50%. Inspired by and commemorating one of Oregon's greatest historical events, the 1804 Lewis and Clark Expedition, the exposition still stands as Oregon's most important economic development effort. Just like the trails to work and promise, the trail to war spanned several generations. During World War I, thousands of young men were recruited to form the Spruce Division to furnish wood for the war effort. One mill occupied the site of Fort Vancouver across the river, a site incidentally preserved by OHS efforts. Others were located in Toledo and Grays Harbor to the north. World War II brought more than 90,000 civilian employees, including thousands of black Americans, to the Kaiser shipyards in Portland and Vancouver. Vanport, Rosie the Riveter, Liberty ships, and there were the forts, camps, and airfields scattered along the western edge of our state, where thousands more in uniform were stationed. The trail to war had a parallel path, the trail to peace. From Afghanistan and Southeast Asia and South America, from Central Europe, Estonia, and Ethiopia, have come immigrants from terror and turmoil, looking for peace in Oregon. Kurt Schlesinger, a young Jewish lawyer from Germany, barely escaped his Nazi pursuers and came to Portland, where he helped other expatriates find work and shelter. As with most refugees, he had to begin again, a new language, a new job, new friends. Oregon is as much a historic idea and an ideal as it is a place. The idea that it is at the end of the trail, indeed to the 18th century explorer at the end of the world, is an old one. That Oregon is an ideal is contained in the word ecotopia. The trail to ecotopia is the most traveled road and runs south to north, connects California to Oregon, and is named Interstate 5. On the trail to ecotopia, we see immigrants escaping despoiled landscapes and cities under siege and coming to Oregon. We here still seem to be a kind of Eden. We've chopped down some of it, built on top of it, but much wilderness and beauty still remains. And Eden does not mean just a garden. It may also be a metaphor for social harmony and for the wise stewardship of our communities and our land. As with those who preceded them, those still coming to Oregon carry their stock of hopes and aspirations. Before pointing you along the last trail, I want to tell you that this story of trails to Oregon, which I have just begun to outline, will be the subject of the Oregon Historical Society's main exhibition next year. We'll commemorate the sesquicentennial of the Oregon Trail, to be sure, but rather than look at only that single trail, we will look at the many trails we all have followed to this emerald demi-paradise. We'll include both the journeys and the connections we share, connections with our individual and family histories, connections with each other's histories, and our connections, most important, with Oregon. By exploring the trails that have brought us all here, we'll have a deeper sense of our shared experiences, a connection that, in my mind, can only bring us closer together. We will travel the first trail, then the trail to discovery, then the trail to Eden, the trail of steel, the trails to work and promise, to war and peace, And finally, we'll travel the trail to the future. Who dares project where this trail will lead us? We have no choice but to look ahead, to plan. Although we today must decide which routes to take along this trail, we won't be alone. We have those who have traveled the other trails to suggest which routes to take as well as which to avoid. I began speaking about memory and history, and I turn now to citizenship. The two, history and citizenship, are inextricably connected. Exactly 100 years ago, 1892, Grover Cleveland and Benjamin Harrison were battling for the presidency. It was a notably superficial, often unsavory campaign, which avoided most of the toughest questions facing Americans at the time: a recession, concerns over the, quote, invasion of foreign immigrants, and issues of housing, education, and jobs. A committee of the nation's leading thinkers, including Woodrow Wilson, proclaimed the need for all high school students to take 4 years of history. Why? The study of history, they said, best prepared the student to exert a salutary influence upon the affairs of his country, because it best promoted the invaluable mental power which we call judgment. The study of history prepared children to assume the responsibilities of citizenship. Oregon's strategic plan, titled Oregon Benchmarks, calls for a state that by the year 2010 will have the best educated citizens in the nation. It's an ambitious plan, but hardly naive. Citizenship, in the truest sense of the word, is the overarching goal. Taking my lead from Thomas Jefferson, I define a citizen as an individual informed of and involved in his or her community, informed especially of its history. A community's history is most simply, but hardly simple, the innumerable associations we have with its buildings, its people, its businesses and organizations, and its neighborhoods. It's local life aware of itself. Local life is dependent upon local knowledge, history. Until we have made connections between ourselves and our community, I don't believe that we can act fully as citizens. History plays an elemental role in developing citizenship. The Oregon Historical Society will further strengthen and commit its own resources to historical education, both within our schools and throughout the Oregon community. A project of special interest, I believe, to all of us here today and all of us listening, will be a major semi-permanent exhibition to open in 1994 on the history and the development of Portland and their metropolitan region. We will work with Carl Abbott and other colleagues at Portland State University and other institutions to build a richly interpretive exhibit that will include important objects as well as interactive technology and electronic ties to the Society's vast library and museum collections. And I will report more to you on this project in the months ahead. This and all of our other local and statewide programs will be provided with Oregon's principal goal in mind: the best educated citizens in the nation. President Jefferson, who sent his explorer scientists Lewis and Clark here nearly 200 years ago, expects no less of us. Now let me offer a preview of a trail to the future. In 13 years, we will commemorate the bicentennial of Lewis and Clark's remarkable journey of discovery. It will be a time for rediscovery. It will be an occasion to celebrate the Jeffersonian spirit of intellectual curiosity, artistic excellence, civic virtue, the full play of the mind, and a time to connect our past with our future. On this trail to the future, it will be a time to show the rest of the world how well Oregon has applied Jeffersonian principles to making its history and to planning its future. Led by President Harvey Scott of the Oregonian, my predecessors at the Oregon Historical Society proposed at the turn of the century the Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition. I am proposing, near the turn of another century, that Oregon host another world-scale event to commemorate the historic themes that inspired President Jefferson to send his two explorers and their corps of discovery west. But rather than the traditional exposition with its multi-million-dollar pavilions and too often money-losing extravaganzas, I suggest that we use as our site the entire city and metropolitan region, as well as the rest of the state. Let's use the infrastructure already or soon to be in place. Our convention, sports and performing arts centers, our museums, educational and public buildings, and our marvelous natural and man-made settings. We even have our own 21st century rail named MAX. Then let's bring to Oregon the world's leading artists and performers, thinkers and teachers, government and business leaders, architects, historians, scientists, and writers, so that in the year 2005, for a brief but momentous time, Oregon becomes the artistic and intellectual center of the world. This is a trail to the future. Let's make Oregon a gathering place for concerts and performances, lectures and informal talks, for exhibits of art, history and science, constructions of architecture, for exploring Oregon's still beautiful natural landscape, and for discussions on planning for the future. For planning must play an important part in this endeavor. We will have something to show people from other cities, states, and nations, light rail, for example, metropolitan green spaces, land use planning, and some of our region's current large-scale and smaller-scale planning efforts. I believe that we have a responsibility to share these plans and how we implement them with others, and they will come to see Oregon and to be part of an uncommonly intelligent world-class event. Throughout all of our work on this large project, we must keep constant the fact that Oregon's history has been and will continue to be built on Oregon's natural history, our land and what grows on it, and the water that usually pervades it. All of our trails have been drawn to and by what nature has endowed Oregon with. We have simply provided the human interest on the principle. Theodore Winthrop, in his 1853 book, The Canoe and the Saddle, describes a torrid 10-day trip through the Pacific Northwest. 140 years ago, Winthrop spoke to the vision and promise of the trail I have just proposed. He wrote, "We have not yet come into contact with great mountains as companions of daily life, nor felt that daily development of the finer and more comprehensive senses which these signal facts of nature compel. That is the influence of the future. These Oregon people, in a climate where being is bliss, where every breath is a draught of vivid life, these Oregon people carrying to a newer and grander West a full growth of the American idea, will elaborate new systems of thought and life." The project I have described, call it for now Oregon 2005, will focus thinking about the 21st century, place Oregon on the world stage, stimulate beneficial economic development, and being grounded deeply in history will foster citizenship, the one quality that, as the words carved on the Skidmore fountain suggest, ultimately defines a city and determines its fate. Oregon 2005 will take time to prepare and must depend on cooperation. Our community's institutions, businesses, and professions must consider how they can bring to Oregon members of their own groups from across the nation and around the world. I, for example, will want to work with my partners at the Art Museum, OMSI, and other institutions to consider how we can bring some great and varied exhibitions and programs here, perhaps for the summer of 2005. Each of you, in your own fields, I hope will do the same. The Society is committing its own resources to getting this project off the ground. Members of our staff are organizing our work, and Debbie Kennedy, former Director of State Tourism and now with Colin Weber, is voluntarily chairing our preliminary planning efforts. This is our trail to the future. I hope you will join the Oregon Historical Society in taking it. Let me conclude with a couplet from Goethe. Whatever you can do or dream you can, begin it. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it. Thank you.
Excellent talk. I think I might even have a motto. for this bicentennial. Come to the Lewis and Clark bicentennial, but don't stay for 200 years. Permit me a personal diversion. Like many here, I came on the trail too. Grew up in southwest Connecticut, which it's hard to distinguish where did New York end, where did Connecticut begin. Tremendous overcrowding and other kinds of issues and problems. Moved then in the mid-'70s to Rochester, New York. Anyone who's lived through a winter there will realize what a deal that is to go through. Thinking about other places in the country, to live, I really felt like much of it was moving away rather than moving to someplace. And of course, Oregon was a very attractive place to move to. But still, I think many have come to Oregon, not so much moving to, but moving away from problems. And going back to your example of the Chinese laborers and living under that feudal system, or the Finns running out of fishing in their native fishing lands, certainly the Estonians, Ukrainians who come here escaping from what they've gone through, Californians out of work and coming here without jobs. I'm wondering if you might be able to comment for a minute about, has this contributed to the Oregon psyche, if you will? So many have come here over the last couple of hundred years, escaping from rather than moving to. Do you see that as a valid social trend?
Do I have another half an hour? The short answer is yes. It is a valid social trend, and you could actually say that it began before people started to come out here. The story of the United States, to some extent, is a story of people escaping other parts of the world and coming to what was considered an Eden. Oregon itself has had a long tradition of that, as my talk suggests, and I could get into much more detail and give more examples on that. I think that if you look at what we have now in Oregon, the diversity of people, the diversity of talents, that you would find, yes, people have escaped, they have left one place or another, but it's not as if Oregon is the only Edenic place in the world. But I think we have managed to garner a larger share of people of talent and skills and vision who have come here. And consequently, I think that's why we have what we have in Oregon. We have a group of people who have come here, waves and waves, successions of immigration. And the result, the synergy that has resulted from these waves of immigration has left us with this endowment, as it were, of talent and vision. And we see it every day in laws and in attitudes toward government and planning, notwithstanding what we're doing to our tax structure. And I think part of the reason we have this kind of vision is that people know what has gone on elsewhere. They have personal experience there, and they don't necessarily want to see the same thing happen again here. And I think that is contributing to some degree to what we have now in Oregon. Good question.
I certainly think it was an excellent speech, and I would like to ask you the question. First of all, this is not really the question, but I'd like to make this statement. What about, should it be just history? Shouldn't it be his and her story rather than just his story?
Certainly.
I would like to know what is being done in being able to involve the citizen, the common citizen that's out there, in being involved not just in volunteer work, but also in giving money. What type of plans do they have as far as reaching out to them? Because I think, just as you mentioned in history there, that this Oregon country, in fact our whole nation, was built on the backs of many people who were just plain common ordinary people. In fact, probably less than that, slaves and working stiffs, as it were. So what outreach is there to them overall?
Are you speaking of the historical societies?
Well, not just historical society. I'm thinking of all of our institutions, our art institutions, the educational institutions, and also the historical society and the others that would be involved as well.
Well, I guess I will presume to speak for others. Why not? take advantage that I have the podium. I think that that as far as programming goes in nonprofit institutions, cultural, educational institutions, that the change, the evolution that I am seeing, and it's certainly the direction in which the Historical Society will be going, is more and more toward education. And it is not simply the kind of education where we are providing our own programs in addition to the schools, but assisting schools in providing what's called alternative or informal educational programs. You see this no matter what kind of institution. The opera, which is a performing arts organization, has its own educational programs. More traditional educational institutions such as the Historical Society and the Art Museum, too, are building up our own educational programs. And I think that this is not simply the wave of the future. I think it's a necessity. The schools simply cannot handle the burden that they are now confronted with. They simply don't have the manpower, they don't have the money, nor do I think do they have the resources, the kinds of materials that, say, a historical society such as Oregon's has to assist in education. And I would say that what we would be seeing is a much greater partnership amongst and between the variety of educational institutions in providing educational services not only to students but also to the general public.
Susan Stone, member of the club. Oregon's always had a reputation as a pioneering state, one where people left each other alone, a lot of individual spirit. Given that history, how do you explain something like Measure 9, which actually takes rights away from people?
I'm just thinking, what's the most politic answer? Let me start with the historical answer. Why not? That's one I feel most confident in. Measure 9 is not, and those of you who might know this history better than I may disagree, it is not uncharacteristic of Oregon and of Oregon history. Oregon has always had a conservative and at times a reactionary element to it. And this dates back to, at least back to the 1830s and 1840s, to missionary times to some extent, to our attitude and actions against the Indians and the Chinese and other minorities. We see it in the history of the KKK in the 20s and 30s, some of our laws that the legislature has actually passed and the governor has signed that eventually were repealed. So there is a history, definitely a history of that. As far as what is going on currently, I think that is more a reflection of the times nationally, and that we have a small minority of people who we would have anyway here in the state reacting to or acting on their own particular biases. And we might see that anywhere. I think Oregon, though, has a much more active political culture. People become more involved. We have the initiative and referendum. We were the first state to push that through. And I think, therefore, we see people taking a more activist role in politics, in government. And we're going to see both the positive and negative aspects of that. And I think Measure 9 is an example of that.
My name is Claudia McDuffie, and I am a member of the club. First of all, I would like to say your presentation was very good. I do have a question, however, that I would like to have you address. You mentioned the trails that many people took to get to Oregon. There is one particular group of people that you failed to include that played a significant part in the exploration and the discovery of Oregon, right on up to the enslavement of African Americans here in the state, up to the presence of African Americans in the participation in the society at this point in time. I would appreciate it if you would, for my own enlightenment and perhaps for some others, explain some of the kinds of things that occurred to African Americans in early Oregon history?
As I recall, my reading of history, the first involvement of black Americans was a murder. A young cabin boy in Robert Gray's ship came ashore and was murdered by some Indians when he was, although they of course may not have seen it as murder, when they stole I think it was a rifle. However, there were, moving from that rather grim episode, there were black mountain men, fur trappers. There were certainly blacks on the Oregon Trail. There were, after the Civil War, we of course got a much larger number of African Americans moving to Oregon, and especially after the 1870s, when after the 14th Amendment and when the Industrial Revolution got going in the West, which of course was a little bit later in the East simply because the railroads weren't out here then. After that, you did have a slowdown, and then of course a great migration during the Second World War, when so many people were coming out here, as I mentioned, to work in the shipyards. It's a substantial story, and I could only touch on it today, but we will be concentrating on it to a much greater degree in the exhibit. Thank you for asking that question.
I'm Ray Polani, a City Club member. Mr. Orloff, you kind of took a look at the future, and of course we all speculate. We really don't know what will happen, but do you think that we will be able to continue to add more automobiles than people to the state of Oregon in the future?
Did everyone hear that question? Well, next year I know we'll be able to add more wagon trains, but I don't think we can or should. Unfortunately, I think we will, at least for a while. My prediction is that at some point in the not too distant future, we're going to see a slowdown in the number of automobiles on our roads for economic reasons. I think simply the cost of fuel will be too expensive. Now that assumes that we're not going to find alternative sources of energy to run automobiles, which we might, in which case we may find a new kind of way of moving people around. However, I think there may be an interim stage there, and I think Max is an illustration of that, and we're seeing it nationally and of course internationally. I think light rail, will come back in vogue and be supported to a much greater extent than we can even imagine. And we will see more people moving around in that way. I think not just the costs in terms of money for fuel, but in costs of time. Exactly. Good question.
I can add some questions from the floor if you'd like. One is, and perhaps taking off from Ray's question, aside from the specific preparations that would be made for this exposition, what do you think needs to happen in the state between now and 2005 so we have something to be proud of in this celebration?
Good. I was hoping someone would ask that. I think we need to, we have a great start in one key area in which we lead the rest of the nation and much of the world, and that's land use planning. I think this is an area, not only land use planning, but community planning, in which we have a lead. And I think that what we need to do, if we are to draw people to Oregon to see how we've done, how accomplished we have been, is to complete many of the major programs and many of the smaller programs, not only in the metropolitan region, but throughout the state, so that when people come here, they see Oregon to some extent as an experiment, a laboratory in which to learn. My thought is that in addition to bringing all these people here to participate in what I've called an uncommonly intelligent world-class event, is that they would come here to study what we've done and then take those ideas back home, back to Iowa, back to Indonesia, and would share some of the ideas and the plans that we have found to be successful. And I think there are many that we have found to be so. Land use planning is one, neighborhood planning is another, our downtown plan, and several others. The way we have managed and are beginning to manage transportation and housing, for example. We are, of course, are not alone in this. These innovations and planning efforts are going on elsewhere around the world, but I think we have done much more than most other parts of the world in carrying out these programs, and I think that's one thing that we will have to show people.
Anybody else from the floor? I've got more here, but we'll be glad to have some people come to the microphone. In the meantime, kind of along that planning theme, we have one person who asked, as you look ahead to Oregon's future, do you see the integrity of Oregon's borders being preserved? And if not, will the state join a larger governmental unit or be divided?
I think Oregon will remain, its borders will remain as they are. For historical reasons, the philosophy of federalism, I think, still exists in this country and holds states the way they are. However, I think one area where we will see much more of an intersection that will cross state lines will be in how we conduct businesses. Interstate banking, for example, larger corporations doing business across state lines. I think we will see that opening up in more areas. I hope that in educational programming, my institution, for example, will be doing more programs with our partners to the north, at least, and I am hoping at some point to do the same with the California Historical Society. It's just one example, and I'm sure that most of you can come up with other examples. But I think as far as politically, the boundaries and the map will remain the same.
City Club member, you've alluded to the history of intolerance against immigrants in Oregon. And I know my grandmother, who was Finnish American, had the same stories. What can we do to prevent what's happening now, say against our Mexican farm workers, to not repeat that?
Absolutely. I think the key to tolerance is education. I think that having put education and the education of citizens as our primary goal as a state, which I think is noble, and some of us may see as naive considering what we're doing as far as taxation. But I think that if the school system, the state school system, schools at the local county level, educational institutions that may not be considered educational institutions per se, but are cultural institutions and social service institutions, that those play a more active role in education, that what we will begin to end up with is people who have a better sense of who they are, what their community's history is, how critical that connection is that they share with their community. I think one reason for such intolerance that we see nowadays is that people don't have this connection. I think we see a lot of insanity around nowadays, and I think part of the reason for that is people are disconnected. They don't have a sense of relationship, somewhat similar to a child who would be left alone and would not have any care. We see that same sort of thing occurring on a community level. And I think the stronger we can build that connection between an individual and his or her community, and that includes their understanding where they've come from, what the history of their community is, what their associations and relationships are with others in the community, that those individuals, children, will have a much stronger stake in the community, will feel more close to it, and one would hope, in turn, would act in the best interest, or at least a better interest, in their community. That's all I would dare to project. I'm not a sociologist.
It's interesting that their last two questions, one of which I think has already been addressed, a lot of interest and concern about tolerance. So I'll pass on that particular question. But the last question that was raised is that some time ago, the Oregon Historical Society hosted an exhibition of the Magna Carta. Can we look forward to other illustrious exhibits of this grand caliber? Before the year 2005, I'd say.
Yes. We will have, just next year, we'll have opening a major exhibition on the theme of the talk I just gave. That after it will show in Portland, it will travel statewide. We will be remodeling, as it were, the entire Oregon History Center, putting in some major installations. One I described briefly on the history and the development of the city, with it not being simply an exhibit that you would learn about the history only, but that you would leave with a much stronger sense of how this city got to be, in this metropolitan region, got to be as it is. With the idea, there's almost a political agenda here, that we are going to be developing citizens who will have a sensitivity to how important planning is and what it takes to build a city, that cities don't simply, especially this one, get to be as they are by serendipity. It takes a concerted effort. In addition to that exhibit, we will be building an exhibition on the history of the Willamette Valley. The Willamette Valley, of course, has been an area that has been core to the history of the state. We will be rebuilding our major comprehensive exhibit on the history of the Pacific Northwest. And finally, we're going to be putting together an exhibit on, of course, Thomas Jefferson and Lewis and Clark. There will be more, though.
Join me in thanking Chet Orloff, Executive Director of the Oregon Historical Society.